recording. Now it's live.
But it was streaming. No?
Streaming, but
Okay.
come out. Now it's live.
Hello everyone and good evening. Welcome to this talk titled Trust and Expertise Online, New Insights for Practice and Research by Dr. Andy Ridgway from the University of the West of England in Bristol. I'll introduce the speaker for today. Dr. Andy Ridgway is a senior lecturer in science communication and associate head of the School of Applied Sciences at the University of the West of England in Bristol. He has also been working as a science journalist for over 20 years now and is on the board of the Association of the British Science Writers. He has written for the BBC Science Focus magazine, New Scientist, The Economist, and Men's Health, amongst other publications. His talk is based on his PhD thesis titled Exploring the Interaction Between Online Practices and Offline Domestic Food Practices in Family Homes, Implications for Food Waste Reduction Campaigns, published earlier this year. I'll hand it over to Andy now.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Anisha. Welcome along. So it's really nice to be able to talk to you about the research that I've been doing really for the past 6 or 7 years. So as Anisha said, this is my PhD research. Before that, I spent a long time as a science journalist. I was a practicing science journalist. Wrote about all fields of science from quantum physics to pulsar stars to things about the human body and so on and so forth. And I worked at BBC Focus for the majority of my working life as a science journalist. So what I'll tell you about is the research that I did that looks at communication online, that gives us insights into sort of what people trust and who people trust and why. Like all research, my research looked at a very sort of niche area, which is communication by parents in relation to food. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment's time. But just to say, I mean, at the moment, I'm sure it's certainly the case in the UK, and I'm sure it's the case in India as well, that there's so much discussion about online communication in relation to science and the environment and the natural world, on what we trust and who we trust and how that influences the behaviours that we take and how it shapes people's perceptions of issues and problems, whether that relates to the environment and climate change or whether it relates to sustainability. So hopefully the research that I'm going to tell you about has sort of broader applicability. At the very least, from a researcher's perspective, it gives us insights into perhaps how we should look at trust and expertise online, because the way I looked at it is a little bit different to the usual way. So like I said, I was looking at communication about food by parents online. There's a very personal reason for me to want to do that. So I live in a family home, so I've got two children. And like a lot of family homes, we waste quite a lot of food. In fact, family homes are a place where, when you look at all household types, it's really quite high levels that gets wasted there. And I became interested in food through a conversation with my wife, because I teach students about risk communication, how people make judgments about risk. And it's a really fascinating topic. It's probably my favourite topic to teach, because there's a lot of our judgments that we make about everyday decisions that we take that are really quite idiosyncratic and quite counterintuitive. So the conversation that I had with my wife was about a pot of yoghurt, and she was saying the date on it was saying that it's gone out of date, we shouldn't eat it. And she's saying, shall I just throw it away? And without thinking about it, I said to her, look, don't throw it away. Don't give it to the kids, but I'll eat it. Which in a way is a bit strange, because that pot of yoghurt poses the same risk to everybody in our household, yet I was prepared to take that risk, yet I wouldn't expose our children to that risk. So that got me interested in food and risk, but also food waste, which is a huge problem. When we think about food and think about the challenges we face in terms of food supply and the environmental impact that it has, a big factor behind that environmental impact is the amount of food that gets wasted in households, certainly in the UK. So what I set about doing was, rather than just looking at the factors that cause food waste in households, because certainly in the UK that's something that's been studied extensively, why do people waste food? I just wanted to look at food and social media, because these days a lot of parents are in touch with other parents through social media and different social media platforms. And from a science communication perspective, there are kind of interlinked topics when we're thinking about food. One of them is food safety. So often parents go online to talk with other parents and ask, is this food safe to give to my children? Because quite often food comes in packages, it doesn't give us a guideline on whether it's safe or not to give to our kids, or when we've stored it for a long time it may not come with those guidelines. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So parents turn to other parents to try and find out whether that food is safe. There's also nutrition and giving children a healthy, balanced diet. You know, parents don't start off as experts about this and child nutrition. So they often ask other parents on social media and try and understand a little bit more about what is a good diet to eat to feed children. So broadly, looking at all of these themes and the conversations online about social media and how parents were making decisions using social media, I then wanted to think about, well, how can you use that knowledge, including about who and what people trust, to inform future food waste reduction campaigns? Because certainly in the UK and elsewhere, there have been a lot of campaigns encouraging us to throw away less food at home. But often they've not been particularly successful, because still a lot of food is wasted. And yet parents are talking to one another on social media. So really we want to understand what they're doing, why are they going there, why are they listening to one another, to then help, hopefully, reduce the amount of food that we throw away by having effective campaigns. So that was the starting point for the research that I did. So the other thing to mention about this form of research when we're looking at social media content is it's a form of media analysis. So I don't know, in some of your studies, maybe you think about media analysis, maybe you think about the way newspapers cover particular topics and how that might influence the way people think about that. So the classic thing is that you look at a piece of text, you look at a newspaper report and look at lots of newspaper reports about that same topic, see the way that they're reported, and then we can infer, well, this is how they might be shaping public opinion. So you're just using that newspaper content as a resource, and that's your subject matter. That's the material that is your data. Whereas on social media, it's quite different, because social media is a form of medium that people interact with. So they post content there, and often that content that they post is about what's happening in their lives as well. So we can't analyse social media in the same way as we might analyse a newspaper article. We really need to look at that two-way relationship between what's going on in people's homes and how that shapes what they do on social media, and then how what happens on social media shapes what happens in people's homes as well. So that's what I did, looking at that recursive relationship. So in terms of where I looked, this is probably a name that you're not familiar with. Firstly, you're based in India, and secondly, I don't know, looking at the age of you, probably not many of you, if any of you, are parents as well. But if you're a parent in the UK, you're familiar with this name, Mumsnet. It's a parenting forum. So it's a website where there are discussion boards where parents can talk to one another and have conversations, ask questions. And it's incredibly popular. So, as it says here, 8 million unique visitors per month and 1.2 billion page views per year. It's a real phenomenon. There are similar parenting platforms around the world. In fact, I think there are some in India as well. So that was my research data. That's where I went to find out a little bit more in the first instance about what parents were discussing in relation to food and food waste. So I looked at Mumsnet, but I also wanted to do some interviews with parents as well, because inevitably when you're looking at Mumsnet, you might just get a flicker of information about what was going on in people's homes that led to them using that social media. So I wanted to get a fuller picture of what was happening. So I did interviews with parents who regularly use social media in relation to food, and some of them use Mumsnet, some of them use Instagram, some Facebook, some WhatsApp, some other platforms as well, to really unpick and tease apart what it was that they were doing online. What were they getting from that social media interaction, and how can we use that to inform food waste campaigns? So as part of this whole picture, I mean, I said at the outset that part of what I was thinking about was communication about things like food safety and nutrition. So, you know, we're talking about communication fundamentally about what we feed our kids, which are our kind of most precious commodity. So trust is a really important factor here. What information do people trust, and who do they trust as well? So in the journey of doing this research, I then started to explore existing theories that are used to try and understand trust, particularly in relation to media content. So a lot of the sort of theoretical approaches come from the field of psychology and looking at what's known as heuristics. So heuristics are mental shortcuts that people use to make decisions really quickly. And so lots of studies have looked at the use of heuristics in media reports, in newspaper reports, and how people use them to make judgments about things like vaccines and other sort of health related things. But there are other studies that look at a more, I describe it as a more methodical way of looking at trust. So they break the different elements of who and what might be trusted down into different component parts. So this is an example: source, message, medium and receiver. So what is it that people trust about a particular source and a message? And the medium itself, is there something about a particular website that makes people trust it more, the layout of it, the design of it? And the receiver themselves, what characteristics of the person who's receiving that information determine how much they trust a specific amount? A lot of it has used a theory called the theory of planned behaviour. And that sounds it's a really intuitive sounding theory. And it says basically that people's behaviours are a result of their intentions, so what they intend to do. That sounds really intuitive. And those intentions, in part, are shaped by their attitudes toward that thing. So to explain that in the context of food research, what that theory suggests is that if people have an attitude that they dislike food waste, and so they intend to waste less food, they are going to waste less food. The only trouble is, when you look at the research, that doesn't happen. When you look at the research, people might say, oh, I'm really not keen on food waste. It's bad for the environment. I waste lots of money. I'm just throwing money away in my bin. And yet, their waste level is just as high as someone who might say that they're indifferent about the levels of food waste. There's a disconnect there, which shows that there's something else going on. It's not just about people's attitudes to sustainability and food waste that are shaping what happens in their home in relation to food. So social practice theory, these theories are just a kind of a lens through which we see the world. Social practice theory is a lens that allows us to see how what we do in our everyday life is shaped by society. So if we think about it, a lot of the things that we do just because we see other people doing them, and it's just the right way to do it. So regardless of what it is, whether it's driving a car, whether it's running, whether it's whatever it is, that's what's in the theory is described as the socially prescribed way of doing that thing. Social practice theory is really good at allowing us to tease apart that socially prescribed way of doing things, but also how other factors might shape the behaviours that we have. So I wanted to look at food through that social practice theory lens, because those social factors have a big bearing on what we do in relation to food. Social practice theory is also good because where most behavioural theories just look at our one discrete behaviour. So it might look at how much food do people throw away. That's one behaviour. But social practice theory lets us look at all of the other behaviours that surround that. So just in terms of cooking, like how you cook, how often you go to the shops, do you eat with friends, do you eat alone? All of those factors have been found to actually have a bearing on how much food that people throw away. So we can't just look at that single behaviour of people throwing food away. So social practice theory is a really good tool to try and understand behaviours in relation to food. So I didn't set out initially to look at trust using social practice theory. It's something that just kind of happened as a happy result of that theory that I'd kind of chosen, which is often the way with research. And there are lots of different versions of social practice theory. I won't linger on this too long. But the one that I chose was developed by a theorist called Theodor Shatsky. And it says our practices, what we do, our behaviours, as a result of our understandings, our know-how, our knowledge, the rules that guide that thing. So rules is kind of, in this theory, is quite a broad thing. So it includes things like cookbooks and recipes and stuff like that. And then the teleoaffective structure, strange sounding word, are people's goals, basically. And they're emotions that are connected to food. So when we think about food and being a parent, being part of a family, there's a real emotional connection with food and what we do in relation to food as well. So it's an important element of the mix. So in doing my research, I thought, well, I want to understand all of the different practices that are interconnected, because I said that social practice theory is really good at enabling us to try and understand the connections and how they all shape one another. So like I said, how often we shop, how we cook, how many people we cook for, all influence what ultimately happens in relation to how much food we throw away as well. That's really clear. But what became clear through my analysis is that there are so many other factors that shape what happens in our home in relation to food, like socialising, going to work, and also social media use as well. So lots of different sort of practices that influence. It's really complicated. It's not just a case of looking at one single behaviour. So now kind of jumping forward and drilling into what I was then finding out in relation to kind of food and trust, and who people trusted and what they trusted online as well. I was trying to really sort of tease apart from those conversations that I was reading on social media and on Mumsnet, how people were making decisions about what they trusted. So when I presented this research at a conference a few years ago, when I was just starting out on my research journey, someone asked me a really good question, and it really threw me. So if ever any of you are in that position where you're presenting at a conference and someone asks you a question, oh my God, that's really, I'd not thought about that. Treat it in a positive way, because it really helps my research. So the question that somebody asked me is, well, do you actually know that parents use that information that they read online? Because I'm looking at this and trying to understand how people use information online to inform their behaviours. So my assumption with all of that is that what people read, they actually act upon. And I was a little bit stumped by that question initially, because it wasn't something that I'd really considered. And I felt a little bit embarrassed because it's quite an important question. So then I went back to the data and I started looking at it for evidence that people were actually using that information. And what I found was that there was that evidence there. You could really see that people were acting on it, often they would report back what had happened. Say one parent shared a really good recipe that was really healthy. They said, oh, my children really love eating this. They would then say thank you and then report back, oh, my 2 children did eat it, thank you for giving me that information. So there was that evidence. I was looking for that, and that's quite important when you're looking at trust. So in looking at, trying to tease apart how people were using that information and how they were making those decisions, what became clear is that they were using certain characteristics of the information on social media. So this isn't me acting as an advocate for this. This is me describing how people are making those decisions. So one of the things was like the length of a post on social media. So when I did the interviews with parents, they would say things like, oh, right, well, if someone's written a lot about that particular topic, they clearly know a lot about it, so I really trust them. So another factor, and this was really quite common, was that they would triangulate information. So if they read the same piece of advice in several different places, I mean, maybe you'll recognise this from the way that you use information online. You make decisions as well. You triangulate information and you look at several different sources and think, ah, right, okay, that must be true because several different people have said that. That's a factor. But also, they said that, well, if a parent had had several children, so that they had got lots of experience, lots of learned knowledge from having that, they were likely to trust them more as well. So, I mean, it's interesting when you tease this apart. They don't know these parents at all. Parents are getting information about nutrition and food safety from total strangers, basically. On the Mumsnet forum, they don't even know their name. It's anonymous. Never mind, you know, their job and what they do, whether they're a nurse, whether they are a food expert, or whether they have no expertise in that respect whatsoever. So they're using these techniques to really try and unpick and try and decide whether they trust information and whether they trust people as well. So I describe this as their social media understandings, their know-how, their knowledge of how you determine whether you're going to trust information online. But they also used their food provisioning understanding. So what I mean about that is their know-how about providing food. So this is a quote actually from one of the parents that I interviewed. And basically it shows that the more parents felt they knew about giving food to their children, the more they used that to assess information other people gave to them. So if they felt they knew a lot of information about food, they had lots of knowledge, they would use that to evaluate what other people were saying. And if they said something that they thought, ah, right, that's true, they would then trust other information from them as well. Other factors were their knowledge about non-food practices. So totally moving away from the field of food. So what people did for their job, their working life. So one of the parents was a nurse who I interviewed, and she said she looked for links to research studies and guidelines. This is basically a sort of health advisory organisation in the UK. So she was using her knowledge of nursing and I suppose of research, talking about peer-reviewed research, to make that decision. So she said, you know, to sum up, I'm more likely to trust something that's science-based rather than just, oh well, we've done it before and it didn't kill any of us. So it's really dependent on what people do in their working lives and other factors as well. And this was an interesting one. So remember, theology is people's goals, what people want to achieve when they're doing a particular activity, when they're giving food to people, when they're giving food to children in this particular context. And she said that she trusted people who were in the same position and wanted to feed their children healthily and give their children good eating habits. So in other words, she would trust parents who she felt had the same goals in relation to food and in relation to parenting. In other words, other parents like her as well. So this is a kind of an interesting mix of things that are shaping who and what people trust. So this diagram that looks like it's straight out the 1970s is my kind of description of that whole picture, really. All of the factors that shape who and what people trust online in relation to food when they're a parent. So their food provisioning understandings, their knowledge about food, their goals in relation to food, their knowledge about parenting as well, and how food relates to parenting, and their goals as a parent, their working life, and also this thing, their social media understandings, their kind of learned knowledge about how you make decisions about what you trust. So the length of posts, the frequency of posts, all of those sorts of things. And all of those things shape people's trust in other parents, other individuals, and other and the content as well, the content that appears online too. So I kind of park that there. So that's the kind of one of the main insights in relation to trust. But I'll come back to it in a moment. But just to give you a bit of a kind of broader view of that research that I did on social media in relation to food and thinking about food waste, what I was trying to tease apart is the nature of the information that people get there. And what these kind of spidery diagrams, what I spent quite a few years of my working life staring at, and they're an attempt to try and plot and characterise that information that people are reading. What was really clear in the social media posts was that the guidance that parents were getting from others often related to several different practices at the same time. So this diagram actually was from as a result of a parent posting on a forum and saying, look, I've run out of ideas for what to feed our kids. We're always eating the same foods. We need to eat more healthy foods. So what ideas can you give me? So some of the parents were saying, oh, well, I look at this magazine for inspiration. This magazine you ought to get. It's really, really good. Others were saying, you know, why don't you look at these particular online sources, these websites? Others were talking about how they plan for a meal, when they do it, how they get ideas, where they look to get ideas, and so on. And then some were talking about actual meals that they cook. So it was curating information about all of these connected practices. So it's curation of knowledge, but also curation in the sense that all of this know-how came from lots of different parents as well. So when I interviewed the parents, one of the common things that I said, well, why don't you just Google information? If you want information about, you know, what ideas of what to feed your kids, why don't you just Google it? They said, well, it's just overwhelming. There's just that much information that you get when you look online. So what they were looking for was this curated knowledge from other parents who'd brought all this together and were saying, look, this works. Kids will actually eat this. And this is how I plan. This is how I can sort of cater for our kids when I'm short of time and so on and so forth. So it's curated knowledge from people who have the same challenges and same limitations on their time and so on. And what was quite interesting was when you looked at different social media platforms, that curation took different forms. So when I spoke to some of the parents who used Mumsnet, they said that what they did to search Mumsnet was to just Google. So if you put in Mumsnet, healthy food that includes carrots or something like that, it would be lots of threads from Mumsnet, thread being a conversation that takes place there. And they would be from the recent past, but also historic as well. So all mums like 5, 10 years ago and so on, who had posted there. So it was this almost this kind of curated knowledge that went back through not quite parenting generations, but certainly through lots of years, a real sort of corpus of information that they got there. So they use that technique to just get that really big body of information. Whereas on Facebook, you can't look at historic posts in the same way. It's not searchable. It's kind of closed groups. So the type of curation that's going on there is quite different. But what parents really liked is the fact that you could group with other parents who had the same approach to feeding their children, the same goals to feeding their children, or the same sorts of challenges as well, so that they knew the information that they got was in line with what they wanted to do in relation to food as well. So different forms of curation. So boiling this down to, the bare bones of it, the reason I wanted to understand this was to try and inform food waste reduction campaigns to make them more effective. The idea being that if we characterise what's taking place on social media, we can really, hopefully, try and replicate that some way in food waste reduction campaigns to make them more effective. So this is that sort of broad characterisation. So know-how recognising food provisioning challenges, so the lack of time that parents have got, or the fact that kids don't eat certain foods. Know-how recognising parenting challenges, again, a lack of time, lack of sort of resources. Now know-how in keeping with parenting goals, in keeping with food provisioning goals. So all of these kind of connected things were why basically parents use social media and makes it rich, and what we would hope to replicate if we're going to launch an effective food waste campaign. So from that, I won't go through these in detail, but I've kind of drawn drawn together a bit of a kind of a go-to guide, a how-to guide in terms of food waste reduction campaigns and how you can run them effectively. So one of the things within that is to consider those factors that make social media so effective at giving parents information. The fact that it's in line with their parenting goals and food goals and so on. So lots of different sort of factors to consider there, and thinking about the different ways that information online, different platforms curate information as well, and lessons from that. But finally, bringing it back to trust, which is the sort of primary focus of this. It's really important when we're putting together a social media campaign. Often food waste campaigns come from an organisation, and it might be leaflets that are handed to parents or online information, and it's from the organisation. But now we know what we know about how people are making decisions online about who and what they trust. It seems to show that it's really important that that information comes from other parents, because they have the same goals, the same priorities, and face the same challenges. And there were influencers. You've probably heard about influencers, like on TikTok and Instagram and so on. But there were what you might describe on a micro scale influencers. And they might be parents who had been on a forum a long time, they'd had lots of children, and just seemed to have a lot of knowledge. Or they could be people who were administrators of Facebook groups. They were really trusted. So there's a new kind of ecosystem online of people who are trusted that, again, these kind of what have been quite top-down food waste campaigns can learn from. So just final thoughts. In terms of looking at trust online, as I said at the start, quite often what we do is look at the material, the content, the media content, and how people determine what they trust in relation to that content. But what this research shows is we need to look at the bigger picture. We need to look at what else is going on in people's lives, the jobs that they do, the things that are important to them in those other practices that then influence what people trust. And for practitioners as well, trust is a really important thing. So in the area that I'm in, and that many of you are in terms of science communication, trust is an important commodity to have. And we try and characterise like who trusts us most and how can we build trust with others. But if anything, this raises more questions, because it shows that who and what we trust as individuals is really quite specific to us. You know, it's down to our judgments about those other people, but everything that makes us us, all our experiences. So you as a student, what you've learnt about how you make assessments, about how you judge information, and what you're going to trust to include in your essay or whatever. What you might have learned in your work life as well, you know, and how you build trust there and so on. So it creates quite a messy picture in terms of who we trust. But I think without understanding that, we're only getting part of the picture of how people make decisions on who and what they trust, particularly when we're looking online. So that's it from me. Thank you for your time. I'll just mention very briefly a new project. It's based in Europe, but we're looking to sort of expand further as well. And it's looking at issues related to what I've been talking about today, particularly trust and expertise online. And the idea is that this project is going to try and share good practice. So hopefully that name is something, the name Coalesce is going to be a name that you're going to hear a lot more about in the next few years. But yeah, thank you for your time. Hope that you found that interesting. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah.
Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I had an observation and a question.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very interesting what you find about the way in which parents use the forum, because I think for anybody who spent any time coding, it's very similar to how we use Stack Overflow, and
Right.
most of us tend to go to these forums almost by default.
Yeah.
And the reasons for that are very similar to the reasons that they have, because there is such a glut of information from Google results directly. And these forums tend to give you solutions that you can use more directly, and you know that they work.
Right,
So
okay. Oh, it's
in that
interesting
sense,
that
it's
there is that,
is
that
very
connection.
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm also seeing that how you're describing the way in which decisions are made, or trust-related decisions are made, are actually very similar to how we make those choices in real life, because who tells us what in what context, and how we see them becomes a very integral part of how we take that information.
Yeah.
And I would actually put to you that the thing that social media has done more than anything else is sort of skew that sense of judgment that we all carry by putting out a lot of information that is fundamentally unreliable, but then that is coming to people through channels that they already trust, and therefore makes us use our judgment based on unreliable data to use to go in different directions.
Yeah, I mean, what this research shows is they were less interested in the platform itself. So they were less interested in, the trust wasn't born out of implicitly from Mumsnet itself or so on. It was of the other individuals on there. That's what they were assessing, really. And just as you said that, one thing that I didn't mention that really relates to that is that there is an interaction between who we trust offline and who we trust online, and that was really clear in the data that I got. So on WhatsApp, what defined those social groups were that those were people who knew each other offline as well. They might have met at a parenting class and so on, and consistently they said, well, I trust them because I know them. So, and that trust was formed, you know, in those offline relationships and then permeated online as well. But one of the things that was really interesting, as I said before, was the fact that it just intrigued me that parents, like on Mumsnet, you use a pseudonym. You don't even use your real name, and there's no biographical information there either. So it's all about, you know, it's using those sort of proxies and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just all the parallels to Stack Overflow are just right there, because you don't have any information about the people who are giving you these suggestions, but you take them because you know that they work. So that's very interesting. The question that I had to do with how much of this do you think applies to the way in which scientific information is curated? Because as with these kind of information, for researchers, the amount of research that gets published is increasing exponentially, and for any of us, it's a very big challenge to keep up with that, you know, wave of publications that we are still required to be aware of, because that defines the sort of the edge of where the field is, right? Which is something that we're all struggling with, and there are algorithms now which are trying to do better and are trying to produce curation, basically, of a very large amount of data. I'm just curious as to how much of this do you think would go in that direction?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So as a researcher, I have to say that I don't know the extent to which we can apply this to other contexts, fundamentally, and I can't say that. But I think then it poses lots of interesting questions about the extent to which this does apply. I am really interested to know that, and using that social practice theory approach to try and understand information in other contexts, and particularly sort of environmental and sustainability behaviours, and particularly things that relate to, where science intersects with everyday life. So we're making decisions based on sciencey information, whether that's about, vaccines, or whether it's about nutrition or diet or exercise or whatever, and how that then connects with social media content and how we then use that to make decisions. I think there's a really sort of rich vein of research there that we could sort of open out. But at the very least, the example and the fact that through the forums that you're familiar with, there were things there that you could relate to, does seem to indicate that there's something there, that perhaps applies to other contexts. But yeah, ultimately we'd need to. Perhaps you could do that with the forum that you're familiar with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. It was really intriguing to see. But as any researcher would want to question the data that you have taken.
Yeah.
I just want to know how the statistics for the advice taken, that you said there were evidences for people coming back and giving anecdotes of how the advice that was given to them anonymously helped them in some sense, and how exactly is...
Sorry, what was that first bit? So
what was the return rate? Like, how many people actually came back and gave a anecdote of how the advice was taken?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. It's not something that I looked at. I didn't look at that kind of sort of the frequency with which people returned. I was more looking at, because it was more of a qualitative study, so not looking at the sort of the figures of it. I was more looking at it when people did return, how could I sort of characterise that interaction, what was going on in there, and using that as that evidence based on that question that I got at a conference as well. But also, in terms of the data, this is where the interviews were really important, because there's only so much then that you can infer in terms of the extent to which people use that information and, as your measure of trust. So what was then important, in terms of from a research planning perspective, was using that insight and the limitations of that first data, because it is a limitation. It's a good thing that you've picked up on. It's a definite limitation that then I really needed to understand in those interviews. That was a really important part. So understanding that connection between information, those judgments, and whether they had actually used that information. So I was very clearly asking, well, did you actually then, when they were giving me a case study and saying, oh, well, this happened, then I was saying, well, actually, what did you do with that information? How did you make a decision on that, and so on? So that was giving me that evidencing link in a qualitative way rather than a quantitative way, which would be to kind of looked at the frequency and so on. So, yeah.
That's good. Another thing that I wanted to ask was basically, there's this quote that everything on the internet is smokes and mirrors. Like, it's not true. Oftentimes people just go out there and blabber something, and eventually it turns out to be a misinformation or a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of something that's existing out there.
Yeah.
So did you find any particular framework or a series of events that occur when misinformation is posted on such forums, and how it is corrected by the collective? No, that's a really interesting question, actually. There weren't any kind of, because it's about food, and because you've got a collection of parents who there is a community there,
I felt that they felt a shared responsibility to one another. So it's not the wilds of the internet where people don't have that sense of connection and so don't feel, concerned about sharing misinformation. So there weren't any issues in that respect. But the nearest thing you got was when parents questioned information that had been posted by others, and just said, well, I don't know that's true. What evidence have you got for that? So they did question one another. But I don't even think then, because misinformation is information that's been deliberately posted online to sort of mislead others, I don't think that I wasn't finding anything that was clearly deliberately misleading information. It might just be a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion quite often, because there's a lot of blurred boundaries. But yeah, another good question, so thank you.
Thanks. It was fun.
So I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
I would first of all frame an example and by that ask. So for example, if there is any person who is posting content online and take example of the food. So for with that with his or her personal experience of how they are consuming food and giving some tips regarding that and posting online. And so the trust factor that is there for both the consumer, the viewer who is watching that content, and the one who is producing that content.
Yeah.
So if that person has the skills to convince people and they are trusting them, but if it's on a public platform, then there is a lot of diversity of different kinds of people.
Yeah.
So out of them, some people they might just find some mistakes or means that some people will appreciate it, some people will just find mistakes because there it's a large amount of people if it's a public platform. Then in that case, for both the sides, that the person who is watching it, that also trust, and the person who is producing that also has the trust that is used in in a genuine way and not just some people is making making different interpretation of it. So for both the person, what should be the things that should be kept in mind while uploading on public platform, or should it be on a private thing where access is to some specific people only and not to anyone?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and something that I didn't really talk about that much, but in the context of trust is really relevant to this. That a lot of the information that was posted was purely anecdotal. So what I mean by that is it's someone who has done something maybe just once and it's gone well, and they've said, why don't you do this? And people have then trusted that, and they've been quite happy to share that information. So some of that might be, quite important health decisions. So in relation to chicken, there were lots of questions about fresh chicken and how long you could store it for. And I got it out of the freezer 4 days ago, I forgot about it, it's been out on the side for that number of days, can I still eat it, that kind of thing. And then someone might say, oh well, we've done that and nobody's died, it's okay. So a lot of the information is really quite anecdotal and people were trusting it. And it's just shared out there. There's no kind of control over it whatsoever. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's what kind of came to my mind when you were saying that. As I say, I'm not acting as an advocate for this information. And I think from the perspective where it gets interesting is when we're thinking about food waste reduction campaigns. So if we think of maybe a government authority that says, right, we want to reduce the amount of food that people are throwing away in their homes. We need a campaign. We need to publicise this and tell people to stop wasting food. What my research is showing is that you need other parents to be giving that advice. The tricky situation, the more difficult situation, is where some of that advice is really quite anecdotal. And I think that's where organisations have to make a bit of a judgment that, whether they go there or not, really. But maybe there are certain types of information that parents share that is kind of on safer territory. But it's quite an issue. But equally, parents get a lot of support, they get a lot of information from that free sharing of information. It's really quite important. hopefully that answered your question anyway.
Yeah, like somewhat. Something. Another thing is that regarding the trust, that it's dynamic also. Like for example, for some period of time, like people are trusting if they are having good experience, but later on if there is any bad experience or something they are not able to relate, then it changes also with time.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't see so much like a change in someone who was trusted. It was more, it was kind of that thing that was happening. So what might happen is that a parent would read information from another parent that they felt was factually wrong. They then use that to write off any other information that that parent would give. So, as I said, a lot of this is about trust of information, but also trust of people, trust of one another that are anonymous, they don't know each other at all, using these sorts of sort of judgment calls that they make. Part of that is if they know about a particular topic and they see another parent has contributed something that they feel is wrong, then they just won't use any other information from them as well. So it is kind of what you were talking about, really. But I didn't really see it where at first a parent was trusted and then they said something that was wrong and then they weren't. That kind of thing didn't play out, I don't think, in the data that I got at least.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Okay, I think that's
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, thank you for listening and thank you for some terrific questions as well. It's been a pleasure talking to you and meeting you. So thank you.
Thank you so much.